Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my review of this poetry collection, The Glad Hand of God Points Backwards by Rachel Mennies. I don't know if it's really fair to say this is a poetry review. I am not very well versed in poetry at all. April was National Poetry Month, and hence I read my one poetry collection per year. I think I spoke in my last book haul, though, that I chose this book particularly because this is a book by a Jewish American woman of a similar-ish background to me, writing about what it means to be a Jewish American woman. So I thought, considering I'm so ignorant when it comes to poetry, that at least the subject matter could really get me into the collection. So here's what the editor Robert Fink has to say about the title. He calls it delightfully enigmatic, and it suggests a deliberately ambiguous, ironic interpretation of God's hand that protects, that judges, that points to history, heritage, and the promises made out to, he's listing a lot of male names from the Bible, and of course, law meted out to Moses and the children of Israel. And I gotta say, I think that tracks throughout the collection. There's a lot of ambiguity and a lot of, I guess, diverse thoughts when it comes to several of these poems. I'm not sure I like the format all of the time, although there's several different types in here, and of course I'm not going to use official phrases for them, but there's, the type with really jotted off, very quick phrases, and sometimes like, a sentence ends, but there's another word from the second sentence in that little jotted off phrase, and I could find that disconcerting sometimes. But there are also poems in here that really read more like prose poetry, like paragraphs. And I thought what I'd do is talk about, well, several of them that I highlighted and put in a note for myself. So really this collection overall did speak to me. We start out with the poem How to Make Yourself Remembered, which touches a lot upon Ashkenazi Jewish history. And the last lines really stuck out to me just because of moving through museums and what I've seen on exhibit there. And this is the sentence she ends with. This way, when they reconstruct your story, the little rubber disc will live forever. An alien saucer with pins to anchor it in an American history museum. The spoon will cradle a weight unasked of it before. So yeah, there's this, I guess, focus on memory, and especially, I guess, given the history of Ashkenazi Jewish history with so many people who were persecuted, just the weight that everyday objects have just to remember these people. We have two poems titled The Jewish Woman in America, then with a year at the end of it. The first one being from 2010, which was around the time this collection was published. And what I see and hear most is comparing and contrasting between ultra-Orthodox women and progressive Jewish women. And she focuses a lot on legs here, which I guess makes a lot of sense because covering your legs is such an issue of modesty in ultra-Orthodox circles. She talks about the women cover their heads, their skirts marking dark mysteries of their legs. But as a progressive Jew, Mennies talks about making a pact with God that's somewhat different, and she ends the poem with, "From him I wrest a path without limits, two strong and willful legs to bear to a street full of eyes." So I just like the continuity there. Then the second Jewish Woman in America poem is from 1941, and she's focusing far less on like religious division between Jewish groups and much more on the idea, I think, that this is among the last times that Jewish immigrants are not completely white yet, so there's really an ethnic center to this that I feel like, you don't talk about as much with, modern day Jews. So she talks about this Jewish woman is a scrub woman, with guttural, unused German, and rattling with strange English words like baseball, highway, and petticoat. Then we have the creation of Temple Beth Shalom, which I'm assuming really is about the architecture of a real synagogue, built by Frank Lloyd Wright, going by this poem. And what I love here is just the visceral imagery of how Mennies describes architecture. Like falling water tumbled over itself in Pittsburgh, and the Guggenheim perched on the Upper East Side. And then God comes in this poem too to tell Frank Lloyd Wright, build, a synagogue for the Jews because I've been a bad father. And she describes Beth Shalom as mountain of glass, giant winged ark come to land on Old York Road. The Jewish profession, I think, reminds me a bit of maybe Midrash, which is a readathon coming up in May. And I think it's completely biased or subjective the way that I'm thinking about the way that other predominantly Christian and atheist members of maybe Midrash talk about God and faith, and how I kind of see it as different from Judaism, and this poem kind of goes into that. I mean, if I'm to stretch things because of what I'm thinking about here, but she's talking about some of the stereotypical Jewish professions, which really comes down here to a tailor, doctor, or a moil. A moil is the rabbi who performs a circumcision. And she ends this poem with, "We calculate our breaking point with a hand made for surgery. So many of us scientists, so few of us evangelists." Then we have the poem for Rose, which harkens to the Ashkenazi tradition of naming your children after departed loved ones. For example, I'm a Rachel, who is named for my great-grandfather Raymond, who died shortly before I was born. And Rachel, I believe, Rachel Mennies, was named for a relative named Rose, which she describes here as Rose. One curling R makes hundreds of us Rachels, Rivkas, Renates, Richards, Ronalds. This slip of a woman in a fading photograph keeps all of our tongues moving. And then she actually talks to God again in this poem. Blessed are you, Lord, of our past on, are looking over us on high. The dead name us, consonants. As we cast aside baby books and run, curious, to the headstones, hunting for names among the mausoleums. As I'm reading through these again, I'm just finding anew that I like these unique ways that she's finding to reach out to God through Jewish tradition. 4,000 Shoes is a poem I feel like I have to mention, kind of, because it takes place in the Holocaust Museum in the U.S., which Mennies calls the D.C. Museum, but you know where she's going, given the rest of the poem. And just living in D.C., I guess, and I even had an internship once at the Holocaust Museum, just makes it feel like I have to stumble upon this. Although I feel like, the shoes that, a major part of the exhibits is, the cast-off shoes that the Nazis made, Jews take off before gassing them. It's something that a lot of people obviously focus on in writing. So it's not necessarily unique, but, I think it's such a striking image. And it's interesting how she turns the shoes into talking about modernity and also Nazis and machines, with her grandfather saying, "This here is work by a craftsman. You don't see shoes like these anymore. My eyes low, archiving my cheap pleather sneakers made by a machine to fit all the feet of the world exactly the same. The still machines of Europe beside the museum, tamed for history." I think Nazis are often described as a machine just because of that inhuman but also just robust efficiency of what they did. Then there's Inheritance, which is about the writer's parents. The father recently died and the mother sort of taking over for the funeral and the arrangements afterwards. These are traditional figures. The father went outside of the home to be, learned and a scholar in Jewish texts, and the mother stayed at home. And the last stanza just really struck me. Death turned your father into a candle, a rock that stands in wind and rain. Death turned your mother into a door that only opens for strangers, a shirt impossible to rend. And some of this certainly speaks to ritual Jewish imagery. We light yard site candles for the dead, or, put rocks on the tops of gravestones. And I thought of death turned your mother into a door for strangers as that she had to be present for the Shiva, which is ceremony of sorts where people come to pay their respects. And also a shirt impossible to rend has to do with you actually tearing or rending your clothes to mourn loved ones. And I figure I couldn't make any sort of ramble review without mentioning a poem called How to Make a Jewish Poem, which is again about sort of personifying the poem with religious ritual aspects to it. Like it starts with, what makes this poem Jewish? Nobody's blessed it yet. Nobody's named it. Named it again in Hebrew. Put that name on a Kiddush cup. Filled that cup with wine. It's purple as a bruise. Then it ends, I think, talking less about a specific poem and more about how she generally put this collection together. But there's also more ritual, like smash a glass under its husband's foot, circumcise its wailing red-faced sons, watch it multiply into a book. Some poems will remember, some will not. And then finally, sit Shiva for its passing once it ends, which I think talks a lot to the creative process for a lot of us, that sense of loss when you end a big project. I Learn of Slaughter, I think, is one of Mennies' more critical poems of Jewish tradition, where she equates kosher slaughter to Jewish persecution, especially wasteful slaughter, because the poem starts with, Sunday in the supermarket, all the kosher meat's expired. And then it ends with, when history says it's time, when we've worn out our welcome, grown fat from the farmer's land, lulled by the sweet sound of praising God, death will come, the knife so heavy in our neighbor's hand. Story from another Inquisition, I feel like, talks about the long road of pain, in a way, of persecution. The Inquisition refers to Spain and Portugal, most of all, rounding up its forcibly converted Jews and Muslims to say, okay, which of you is, secretly practicing your old faith, and how are we going to get rid of you? And so a lot of people pretended to be Catholic in order to save their lives and became a group of, in Judaism, called conversos. And in general, I feel like it can be quite heavy feeling connected to all of this history. So after this poem where she talks about a character called Deborah, who wasn't a Jew and then she is, and talks about one of her relatives who spoke Spanish, outwardly, and Polish secretly to his wife, the poem ends with, maybe Deborah's always been good at keeping her own secrets, the clarinet that makes her weep, street corner klezmer, the melody she knew before she came into existence. She always felt old, so old, older than all the graves of Europe. Which, wow, I don't know, that idea of feeling older than all the graves, of all of that, persecution and pain, it resonated. Speaking of Spain, we have Huevos for Seder, which is a multi-part poem that takes place in Spain. But the part that spoke to me the most, again, was part 2. Maybe it's connected to all the graves of Europe, or certainly the idea of the wandering Jew who was never at home anywhere. Because this part says, map of Europe between us, Madre and I sit at her kitchen table. You are Jewish? She asks me. I'm American, I say. You are Jewish, she says. America, invention of the nomad, roof over the outcast's head. Then I'm German, I say. No, she tells me, kind in her surety. I am Spanish, you are Jewish. Thus I learn about nationalism, that unscalable wall, that darkened padlocked home. I inherit the menacing map entire. I live lost in each nation of sand. So yeah, that just packs a punch in terms of Jewish history. Amida for Jewish girls returns more centrally to religion. The Amida is an important prayer set in most Jewish services, and she peppers this poem with some of the transliterated lines. Like when she thinks of her as a woman having to relate to the patriarchs, she says, God, whom we thank for these big men, you are mighty forever, my Lord. You resurrect the dead. But in fact, this is a sexual poem, and it relates the Amidah to women, having relations. And so when I lie with him, my body already knows what to do. As he shifts his weight, moves his hips. You cause the wind to blow and the rain to fall. That's one of the lines. Not sure what all religious people would think of this poem, but I think it's certainly clever. How Will You Raise Your Children is a poem that's definitely more challenging for me, because it takes away that idea of Jewish centrality in a way, and it's like posits that, you could go one way or another, and Judaism isn't that different from Christianity in a way. Like she's asking here, in what tongue must you pray, Hebrew or Latin? Do your holy men anoint babies with water or knives? Do you bless the wine from the prophet coming or the prophet gone? And finally, I thought I'd end with the second to last poem, Rapture, which technically I think a lot of the language in here is certainly more Christian than Jewish, and there's even talk of a pastor and that sort of thing, but the imagery, again, is so stark, so visceral. And it compares life to a peach, and it ends with, peach God, wrapped for carrion, turning above us in the heavens, waiting for us, ripening to satisfy ourselves. Come to him pitted, come to him finished, made rotten by your sweet time in his sun. So, wow, that's an image. And with that, I guess I will sign off. Honestly, I have no idea what this video might sound like when it's all completed and put together. I again, don't have much of an idea, I suppose, how to review poetry, so I decided just to ramble off some lines that spoke to me and hopefully explain a little bit of why. And for more information, I will link to my Goodreads review for this poetry collection down below. In the meantime, the weekend is upon us. I will probably be going to visit family. My niece had a great report card and felt like it was a cause for celebration. I remain half vaxxed, but my final appointment is coming up next week. Of course, I also have plenty of other stuff I should be doing, like the BookTube prize reading, now that we're about halfway through the quarterfinals. But I also hope to be back on this channel imminently with my next and April book haul, so stay tuned. In the meantime, thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.